My name's Sally Lehrman. I'm a long-term journalist, and I founded the Trust Project out of a concern for the decline in trust in the news that we were seeing, and now it's turned out to be really relevant um, in regard to the rise of misinformation that has kind of taken root due to this decline in trust. So I hope that you will leave the session today excited about the need and the potential for building trust with the public, energized to do one or two things that are part of the trust protocol, like clarifying your ethics policies or highlighting diverse voices and your commitment to that, for instance, and also aware that the trust indicators are a global standard that you can be part of. And so as the title says, really what we want to aim to do today is connect trust that you are building with loyalty, and then how does that connect with revenue? And think about how and why you can build this foundation of trust that we know from our work can really is attached to a willingness to pay. So we'll get started by introducing our panelists. And maybe Jessica Sterling, my executive assistant, is helping out with the slides, but let's go ahead. So I think so we can just see the panelists. Maybe we have to stop screen sharing for a second. So first I'd like to introduce Coburn Dukehart from Madison, Wisconsin. She's the digital and multimedia director for the nonprofit, nonpartisan Wisconsin Center for Investigative Journalism. They produce Wisconsin Watch, an investigative journalism site, and are members of INN. Dukehart has a master's degree in photojournalism from the University of Missouri, and her multimedia work has been honored with a Webby, a Gracie, a Murrow, and DuPont Awards, and she was nominated for a National Emmy. Francisco Neri is joining us from Miami, Florida, where he is COO for Cambio 16 and its sister publications, one in finance and one in energy. And Cambio 16 produces a monthly magazine online, in print, and on social media, and their coverage regions and areas include Spain, Colombia, and Venezuela. Before joining journalism, Francisco was a Red Bull North America pro athlete for over 7 years in the sport of skydiving. And so I assume he's got a lot of experience with risk-taking. He's got multiple top 5 finishes at world-class competitions. He's also a lawyer, graduated from the Universidad Católico Andrés Bello. Dan Petty is our third panelist. He's joining us from Denver. He's the digital director of audience development at Media News Group, the parent company of the Denver Post, Orange County Register, San Jose Mercury News, and Boston Herald, among others. He leads the efforts there to build a loyal and engaged audiences on the digital platforms, which include newsletters, social media, mobile apps, and also digital subscriptions. And I wanted to mention he's a president of Denver Press Club, a 150-year-old institution and one of the organizations working hard to rebuild trust in the news and also support free speech and access to information. And he'll begin pursuing an MBA at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School in August. So thank you to Jessica for running the slides. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining us. And thanks to the audience. So I want to provide a little background on trust to start with, and then we'll get to some questions for the panelists. And I really hope that we can have a good amount of time for your questions as well. So, and please keep them going in the chat as you think of them. So this is the latest data from Edelman Trust Barometer. They do this study throughout the world, and you can see right now they say trust in news sources at an all-time high, and you can see there with traditional media, an increase of 7%. So that looks fantastic. We know that site traffic is up. However, I think we need to really realize that there are a lot of regional differences, and differences depending on who's doing the measuring here. So it's a bit of a soft measure. And at the same time, a full 60%, even in this survey, said they were not confident that journalists were covering COVID-19 pandemic in an impartial way, that they were not confident that we actually could set aside our ideological and political biases. And then we can also say we've seen Black Lives Matter protesters challenge journalism's commitment to inclusive and accurate reporting. So I see this moment right now as a great time to continue to build trust and also that there's a great need at this moment. So how can we do that? Well, we can look at academic research as a start, and academic research tells us to think about trust as a relationship. And when you think about trust with a person you know or trust with an institution, it really rests on these 5 factors. So integrity and ethics are, do you feel like you share the integrity and ethics with this institution? Do they share it with you? Are they reliable? Are they consistent in their actions? Can you expect them to perform or to behave in ways that adhere to that integrity and ethics? Do they have positive intentions? So if something is broken about that relationship, can you be sure that they will work to help repair it? Or if they make a mistake, you make a mistake, can that be repaired? And then lastly, competent. Um, are they competent, and can you rely on them in that particular area? So trust is this important relationship, and our relationship with the public isn't quite as good as it should be. If we look at those 5 factors, essentially that's why I started the Trust Project 5 years ago. Um, we've grown into a global standard for news. Others have come into this field, but we're the only ones to be in use by newsrooms and also technology platforms. We are journalism generated and responsive to user needs. And this is really where I hope to be able to share some of the things that we've learned through this process. So we started out really trying to understand through a user-centered design process, what is it that the public really values in the news? When do they trust it and when don't they? And then we took that, and what was so interesting is it really did match up with those 5 different things. And if you could go back one more slide again, Jessica, there for a minute. Then we took what we learned from the public, and we connected it with journalism standards. We brought together news executives from around the world, mostly Europe, US, and Mexico, and talked to them. How do we take what we learned, these factors, and marry it with journalistic values, and then find a way to help the public understand the difference between journalism and everything else that is out there? Because what we were learning is that, as you know, journalism online looks very much the same as anything else, whether it be a piece of information designed to sell you a pair of shoes, to sell you a partisan agenda, or even incite you to violence or completely misdirect you. So can news organizations recapture this role of being the guidepost, of being the lighthouse to guide the public at sea, just in this flood of information, trying to sort out what they find what they need, and also help guide the new technology platforms to surface more reliable news. So in our meetings with news organizations, we worked together and came out with 8 trust indicators that we could show on the sites and that had machine readable markup. And what I'd like to do is show you examples from our news partner sites. So you can go on to that next slide, please. So here we have Wisconsin Watch. And you can see right there, they say their mission. It's a nonprofit newsroom that focuses on government integrity and quality of life issues. You can see the connection with the Trust Project. And then right there on the article page is read our policies. So if you go to the next slide, you can see what that looks like. They have a set of policies that all of our partners show. And this gets to users' concerns about agenda, because we heard over and over, we understand newsrooms or journalists aim to be impartial, but everyone's got an agenda. So what is your agenda? And through showing this, what we aim to do is help people understand that our agenda is to serve the public, to serve you, and to help you, member of the public, to make decisions about your own community, your own lives, your government. And so these are the guardrails that we put around what we do in order to ensure that we really are serving you, and as opposed to some external agenda or trying to sell you a product, let's say. So the next trust indicator, which we'll show, this one got to people's concerns about, what are we really looking at? Is it news or is it opinion? It seems to be blending together. Do journalists even know the difference? And so all of our news partners show labels that demonstrate this is news, this is opinion, this is analysis, this is paid content or sponsored content, other kinds of things. And we all share these definitions. And you can see here on on the Orange County Register, the definition for opinion, you would see the same one on Wisconsin Watch, you would see the same one on Cambio JCC, or BBC or Washington Post and so on. And then the next one shows that the Denver Post and the San Jose Mercury News even include definitions for news, which we don't require. It's included in the markup, but not on the page. And I think this is a great idea, just to help remind people, what is journalism all about and what is news? Next slide. All of our sites offer information about the journalists, and it starts on the article page with a few pieces of information. And then we go to the little bit more structured information about who that journalist is, where they're located. We ask journalists to include topic expertise as well as demographic expertise, because people were looking for that, as well as languages, if they're speaking other languages beyond English, and ideally even mentioning that that's their primary language. And then the next slide, and I should say all of those sites that you saw are on WordPress. We do have a WordPress plugin. And then here we have Cambio JC6 kind of pushing this out into the world in a new way through social media and bringing in this media literacy component. So here they ask, what is the Trust Project? And bring folks back to the what we call the journalist information trust indicator. Who made this, and details about the experience of the journalists, their background, and so on, is all included in Cambio JC6 is displaying this here. So finally, these are the 8 trust indicators: best practices, that's the agenda, about the agenda, information about the journalist, labeling, news analysis, and opinion. We have citations and references and methods, that gets to your stories, not all of them, but ones that would be more controversial, let's say, or you put a lot of investigative work into it, you want people to know that. Then providing that information. People wanted to know, how was the story built? Should I trust it? Is it locally sourced? That's the next one. Does the journalist know me, know my community? That's where members of INN are particularly strong. Diverse voices. People wanted to hear from more than just people at high levels of business and government. And they said, in particular, we want to hear about people like ourselves when we feel excluded from the news, and also unlike ourselves. So really, this is a place where people see it is important to learn about the constituent groups of society. And then finally, actionable feedback. So an expectation of public engagement that goes beyond just comments. And I know in the last panel that was talked about a bit, and also this is something that INN really works on as well. So with that, I'd like to shift over to the panel. We'll come back to these descriptions a little bit about what we know about how trust can grow and then build loyalty a little bit later on. So, but let's start with changing newsrooms, policies, and practices. And starting with Dan, how has participation in the Trust Project changed your newsroom practices and culture? And most importantly, right now, I'm wondering, are there, your reporters are facing attacks on the streets and online. And so how does this current environment help you, or does it make you rethink how you build trust and why you should build trust?
Well, I think if anything, we've found over the last few months, certainly within the last few weeks, that delivering trustworthy, reliable information is absolutely essential, and anything that we can do to improve the transparency and discussion of how we gather information and facts is critical, and the Trust Project's indicators are a key part of that. You showed some of the examples of, some of the things that we provide on just even our biographies. Like, prior to working with you, Sally, and the Trust Project, it might have been like 1 or 2 lines about like, I'm this reporter and I cover this beat, and that's maybe the extent of it. Not anything about location, other information that might be relevant and valuable. And so, these kinds of things are just absolutely essential. And I think we're being rewarded with it with increased audience attention. I focus on audience across Media News Group. The demand for our information and work is has never been greater. It's starting to come back a little bit, but certainly through coronavirus, certainly through the protests and the Black Lives Matter coverage, it's been a huge focus for us. And so trust is just absolutely essential. We're fortunate, like a lot of publishers, to see tremendous growth in audience subscriptions. At the same time, we're seeing declines in advertising, and I don't think people would be willing to, open up their wallets for us and pay us for information if they didn't trust us. So trust is just absolutely foundational to the core of what we do. And if we can do anything to, be transparent about, what a news story is, what analysis is, what an editorial opinion, all that stuff leads toward, I think, achieving the goal of, coming up with a business model that makes this sustainable for a long time in the future.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I hope we can come back to some of those questions about how does it connect with the business model and what are you really learning. Coburn, and of course, all of our sites that join the Trust Project really are already committed to integrity and trustworthiness. Otherwise, they wouldn't have joined. So again, for you, like, what are the conditions now that you're experiencing that make it especially important? And are there certain trust indicators or practices that you feel are especially important right now?
Yeah. So like Sally said, when we were invited to join, we actually had a number of these policies already in place, mostly public facing, but we didn't really know that they were the trust indicators until we got the requirements from the Trust Project. And then when I started reading through them, I was like, oh, this is great because we already have all these policies written. But what joining the Trust Project allowed us to do was to clean up, to clarify, to revisit all of our policies, to take a harder look at them, to separate them out into separate sections of our website, and also to enhance some places where we needed to improve in terms of the indicators. One of those places was that we didn't have a very good method for user or reader feedback. So we did start letters to the editor section that we didn't have previously prior to joining the Trust Project, and we've enhanced our opinion section and letters to the editor section. Also, I think this is also along the same time, we have enhanced our presence on social media, invited more feedback that way. And then again, especially in today's climate, we took a more closer look at our ethics policy and our diversity statement and revamped those just to bring them a little more up to date. And so some of those we needed to run by our board of directors. Some of them we don't. One of the benefits of working for a really small site is that when we want to make a change, we're able to just do it ourselves. There's not a lot of roadblocks. Like, I am the digital director and the project lead for the Trust Project. So when something on our site needed to be changed, it was pretty easy to just make those changes, and luckily had complete buy-in from the whole professional staff and our executive director. So it was really fun to go through the process of being part of the Trust Project. It mostly verified that Wisconsin Watch, for me, it is a really wonderful place to work because of their commitment to truth and accuracy and fairness and transparency, especially in where our funding comes from, which is something that we make very public on our site.
Yeah, and that's so great, and that's partly why, as you said, we wanted to invite you in. And I know a lot of INN members share those commitments, and you can't even be a member of INN to tell you certain things you do disclose. I wanted to ask if you could talk a bit about some of the things that we talked about earlier in our conversation, where you're seeing more sites in Wisconsin and elsewhere. We see it around the country that look like journalism but aren't really. And so how does being more transparent about what you do help in that context? Could you elaborate a bit there? That's for Coburn. Actually, I think with Coburn may have frozen there, so I'm going to go ahead with the next question. I'm going to go ahead with Francisco. We'll come back to Coburn. Francisco, you and your reporters have worked in some very dangerous areas, both on
those in Wisconsin, and
here we go.
It's really important that we were a part of the Trust Project before these sites started to come online, because it gives us the opportunity to emphasize that we are a fair, accurate, and trustworthy news organization. in today's climate. And there have been articles written that have compared us to some of those sites, and sort of emphasize that we are fair and trustworthy as opposed to some of the other sites that don't disclose, especially where their funding comes from. Sorry if I broke up a little there. I got a note that said my internet connection was unstable.
That's okay. Yeah, we got the end of it, and I hope folks can hear me now. There we go. So I wanted to bring Francisco into the conversation. Francisco, you and your reporters have faced some really difficult reporting situations in places like Venezuela, and also in places that are hardest hit by the pandemic early on, like Spain. So how would you say the challenges that journalists are facing right now affect how you think about building trust and also your ability to do so?
Yes. Basically, we've had a very clear experience from before we joined the Trust Project and the after. I think everything has been much better organized regarding internally and externally. Also for our audience, for them is clear to understand what the trust mark represents and what the best practices it's all about. And now that we're going into topics as delicate as how the pandemic was, or covering news in Venezuela where there's a lot of censorship in many different levels, having the trust mark and having the method that the Trust Project brings with the trust indicators gives the audience a clear message that we are transparent, that we use a method to work the news that we publish daily. And also internally, I think it has given our newsroom a lot more confidence about them showing to everyone all of our information regarding our ethics, regarding the information of the journalist that is working on the article that has been published, what's the article about, and what the audience is expecting from that article after they get what all the trust indicators that are alongside that article will reflect. So basically, I think that has been a big stepping stone in building trust and following what Dan said. It's definitely the core of everything. Uh, we've also had a very big increase in results in SERPs, in search engine results positioning, which we're happy about, and we understand that that has also to do with that upgrade that comes by implementing the trust indicators on our day-to-day work. So basically, I think that that has been, a before and after, basically. And when it comes down to sensitive topics, I think credibility stands by hand in hand with what we're talking about here and what we're working with. So that's been definitely our experience in our path. And it's only been a few months, it's been 4 or 5 months since we started, since we did the launch, but it's very promising what we're seeing. And I think as we work to adapt this also to videos and other formats, it's gonna be even a bigger impact because a lot of the consumption of news reporting it's made in video, and I think that is gonna open another important step to work on.
Thanks. That's a great point. And one of the things I wanted to ask you, because a lot of folks here have not implemented the trust indicators yet, and it would take some time. So what are some of the key things that you've changed in your newsroom to help build trust that you think would be a good place to start? So let's, I think Coburn's back with us. Thanks for, she had to kind of come off and on, but Coburn, could you just talk a little bit about some of the things that you felt were most important to start with immediately? You had mentioned diverse voices and ethics being two things that you reviewed.
Yeah, so definitely, well, one thing that we had on our site previous to joining was that we had all of our policies sort of smushed together on one page, and we hadn't really fleshed them out. So we did, like I said, take a closer look at our diversity statement and rewrote that. Revisited our corrections policy, our unnamed sources policy, and then as Dan mentioned, we also beefed up our author profiles and expanded those to include something that was important that we had not thought to mention before, was what languages some of our reporters spoke, and that has come in really important in some of our coverage, especially recently.
Yeah, can you elaborate? So how did that become important?
Well, for example, I mean, I don't think we had really taken a look at who on our staff at the time was a Spanish speaker, or what diversity in terms of which communities we could connect with based on our language capabilities was at that time. But the year after we rolled out the Trust Project, we had one of our Spanish speaking reporters do a really deep dive into some immigration coverage and do a story about some labor trafficking. So it was really important, I think. I think one of the things that I've been thinking about is it's not only important for the public that the trust indicators are on our site and that we make it really clear who we are, but for some of our sources who might be reluctant to speak with us, to be able to say, okay, here's our, like, call up, hi, I'm a reporter, this is our website, please check it out, please decide if, I think some of our sources make a decision about whether to speak to us or not on the record based on whether they think that we are a trustworthy site. So for this particular story we did about labor trafficking, we had some very reluctant sources, and one we actually did have to keep anonymous. So it was helpful, again, to have a policy on unnamed sources. It was very clear on our site about what we will and will not agree to when agreeing whether to keep a source anonymous. And the source and the lawyer that was representing that source could clearly read that on our site before they decided to even enter the reporting process with us. And then for that particular story, we did a behind the story, which is something that we've also started doing more since joining the Trust Project, is explaining more about who we are, how we work, and doing some more deep dives into behind the stories. So we did started a video series explaining some of the processes behind our reporting, which is something we hadn't done prior to joining the Trust Project.
Great, that's really interesting. And I love the way that you're connecting up this sort of relationship of trust that really is a cycle among the journalists, the source, and the outlet itself, and that we have to build trust all the way across that, and as well as the audience.
Yeah, and I will also mention that because we work with a lot of student journalists, I think it's also important that when they join us, that they are able to clearly read all of our policies and understand the sort of organization that they're joining and what's also expected of them as a young reporter joining our staff.
Great. Yeah, so kind of bringing journalists into some consistency in practices, as well as making the public know, or helping the public know about that too. How about you, Francisco? What is like one or two things that you've instituted that you think are really key toward building trust?
Francisco, you're on mute.
Basically, a lot of the things that Coburn mentioned are experiences that we had just the same. Especially, as she said, one point that it's important for us was how things have changed when we're working with outside sources. Now that they see that everything is structured in a way that is really clear to understand on how our ethics work, who is our team, who are we funded by, everything that we do that is structured in the best practices, it's been much better with the sources and also with, I think, other third-party authors that that are much more interested now in being part of Cambio 16, because we have, say, structured all of this by implementing the Trust Project. And like I said, also internally, this is giving a boost of confidence to the newsroom. When you have a new journalist or you invite a journalist to work with us and they see that, they automatically get a very different sense and of how things are working, because they see that it's all out there for everybody to read and for them to understand how it works. So I think it's an overall package more than one or two things, and that's would be my, my biggest comment here, that this works as an integral tool that it's aimed to go 360 degrees towards your audience, towards um, advertisers, towards your team, and everybody that your newsroom is involved with.
So that's interesting, because both of you, I mean, you've talked a bit about standardization. Coburn kind of helping bring young journalists in. I noticed a lot of folks on this call do have internships, or you're working with colleges and universities. Francisco, you're talking about building that within the newsroom. And Dan, you had mentioned that you want to talk a little bit about the plug-in, the technology side of how this has enhanced your newsroom practices, and specifically some of the things that it helped you do. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so we, all of our, I should say, our largest sites use WordPress VIP, and it's been really convenient to just have a WordPress specific plugin that this works in. So the fields kind of come in preset. And so corrections is a really great example. When I was in the newsroom at the Denver Post much more consistently, now I work with all of our publications. Corrections were kind of this Wild West thing of like, well, I guess maybe we'll put it at the top of the story. Maybe we'll put it at the bottom of the story. Maybe we'll format it this way. Maybe it's not a correction. Maybe it's just an update. And, really sitting down and thinking through, what corrections were, when to make them, where to put them, and how to structure them. Again, kind of to talk a little bit about Coburn said, that the actual process of going through and thinking about it. But again, like from a technology point, having standardized sets of fields across the various newsrooms in our company. We're not scaled out everywhere yet, but it's our goal to do that. But really sitting down and working together to set that up has been really, really helpful and important. Like anything, this stuff takes time. So there's other fields for sourcing and methodology, citations and references, and we use those right now primarily on really big reporting stories. I'd like to see us probably expand the use of that a little bit more to add additional transparency. It does take work and time, and we still have, I think, to again, keep encouraging the journalists to leverage those fields and use them to be much more transparent and open. But it's definitely further along than it was prior to our launch. But as with anything, it can always get better and improve.
And Dan, you said you want to expand it. So are you doing that because you think that you're getting a positive response from users, or why add more detail to where you're getting your information?
I just think it's always a good thing to just explain this stuff to people. I think most people on this call are probably familiar with talking to people who are outside the industry and don't understand how we do our job, particularly now during, we think about all the misinformation that's floating around about coronavirus and other things like that. The more that we can be transparent, the better. And that's really what I say to the journalists when they ask, I got to do, some extra work here. Doesn't it make sense for you to take the time and the little bit of extra time to try to indicate, where the source came from, who you talked to, and all those other things. And again, it is extra work, but it does make a difference.
Well, thanks. And I wanted to turn that kind of bleeds to one of the questions here that wanted to know, a person, Allison, wanted to know from Investigate West wanted to know what can potential partners bring to the Trust Project that would be helpful. And that's just it. So citations and references is a good example. So it's type of work where we really work as a network, as a collaborative. So with the citations and references, as we learn more about what works well and what's difficult for news partners to get into the workflow, then we can adjust. So we've gotten more and more interest in the citation and references feature, I think because of what's been happening with COVID-19, with lots of rumors and misinformation out there, confusing folks, and also even scientific literature now getting out really early before peer review. So we've been thinking about, can we sort of extend or deepen that citations and references indicator? And also, can we enhance the WordPress plugin that we have in order to make that possible? So that's some of the things that our news partners bring to us. It's just this network, adding to the network, adding to experience, and adding to the debate and discussion that can happen throughout our process. And then the question too was, what is phase 3? Well, that's a reference to how we work. We just, if you're interested in participating in the Trust Project, then you come to our website, you leave, there's a little screen door form that you fill out just to say that, and then we would bring you back in for a prospective partners meeting, tell you what it's all about, and then you fill out a form, this application. And so we do that in phases. So once we collect enough folks to become a group, then we put them in a phase. Right now we're in phase 4, actually, where we've got sites from around the world working together, having conversations about things like, when do you make corrections? What's the minimum mistake, I guess, that would warrant that? Where do you put corrections? Things like that. We can have conversations globally. And then we just continue to move through new phases. There's another question here about any work happening to bring the Trust Project's methods to smaller ethnic media outlets. Or also, how do we, I guess, open it up to make sure that not just the bigger organizations benefit? And that's one of the things that I think is really key to how we work in the Trust Project. We really want this to be something that is available to true news organizations around the world that really have a commitment to producing journalism. And so that's the reason for having this WordPress plugin, because the idea is to make it as simple as possible for you to incorporate the trust indicators. And really what it comes down to, once you have the plugin, is thinking carefully about your policies and practices, thinking carefully about, are there some places where you'd like to build and grow? Are there some things where you can help us build and grow? And on the ethnic media front, yes, we'd really very much like to bring in more ethnic media organizations. We have kind of recognized that there already is a very strong level of trust there, but just as Coburn kind of started us out, that there is already so much trust in journalism, and yet there's already always more a need for us to grow and build new audiences and help people understand what are these underpinnings of journalism and how do they differ from everything else out there. So I'd like to shift back to the panel here for a minute and ask you a little bit to say a little bit more, tying this question or this equation as I see it, of building trust to then enhancing loyalty to your publication and then ultimately enhancing revenue. And I think it works for different ways across different types of organizations. So Coburn, could you tell us a little bit about your experience there? And I think in particular, you've talked about using your emphasis on trustworthiness to help bring in donations. And
yeah, so our organization is very much funded through individual donations as well as foundations and grants. And so, even before we became a full-fledged member of the Trust Project, we were extremely transparent with how we worked and where our funding came from. But by joining the Trust Project, it gives us sort of the official seal of approval. And again, like I said, we went through a process of enhancing some of our policies that allows us to tell our donors, hey, look, we have the seal of approval. We are a member of the Trust Project. We are completely committed to transparency. You can read all about it on our site. We've made it as easy as possible to find information about it. And, I can't say it's increased donations by X amount, but I can say that we do get handwritten notes along with the check that say, thank you so much for your commitment to transparency. Thank you so much for your commitment to trustworthy news. People have noticed, and they do mention it when they make donations to us. So it is a very important part of our fundraising model.
So something to consider, in particular, if you feel like you already have pretty strong level of trust, or if you want to become part of like this overall movement to build some consistent standards around trust, consistent practices that the public can recognize. Francisco, how about you? what have you noticed changing in audience perceptions about CompUS 16 as you implement these trust indicators?
For our part, we've seen basically when the launch was done and Association of Journalists in Madrid found out that we were joining the Trust Project, and there was only El País and El Mundo being part of them locally in Spain. I think that that was a big boost in a sense of our commitment to trust, in our sense that we are a 49-year-old printed magazine, but we've only been working on an online news for the past 8 years. So basically, it's a new route and it's a new avenue that we're learning on. And becoming part of the Trust Project was one thing that we thought from the get-go that it was gonna help us, basically ensure that trust with our audiences and be better structured in that sense.
So it sounds like one of the benefits of really emphasizing transparency, let's say, has been to raise the profile of your organization and kind of the stature of it in this media world. And we think about Spain, like I know that some publications have just recently celebrated like their 100-year anniversary. There's probably more that some in the 150 years. So 50 years isn't that much in that kind of world. So that's very interesting. How about you, Dan? What would you say in terms of how the trust indicators have made a difference for you, and have they made a difference in how people perceive your publications? Have they made a difference in subscriptions? Or are there any other kinds of indicators that you have noticed or metrics that have changed as you really emphasize, I mean, not necessarily even part of the Trust Project, but as you emphasize transparency and building trust?
It's a little tough to sort of separate the noise, just given that we kind of launched and then we, plowed into global pandemic and social unrest after that. But I think what's really helpful, and Coburn kind of mentioned this, is that having a single place of policies and standards, which we have to go through the Trust Project when people have questions, we can just point them. We had like an ethics policy, but all the other stuff about how we handle sourcing and methodology and the diversity of our newsroom, all of those things, we now have kind of a single page where we can just point people to that talks about all of those things. And that's a rigorous process. And I think that when people ask questions or they're unsure because, again, somebody might not know the difference between the news side and the opinion side, that's a really common thing. I think having those things on top, that type of work is really important. But to have a single place where people can go, just when those comments come in, like, well, how do you know this? Or how did you figure that out? Or where did that come from? To be able to point people to one place is just really important and essential.
Yeah, and that's interesting because I think there is some front end work where you're really working out your policies, thinking about them, talking about them within the newsroom. But now you're talking about kind of a ease of use at the other end, where once all that's done, you can point to it.
Yep.
And I will say that we get questions where someone will complain to us about the way a story was written or coverage area. And I know I can feel confident that I can point them to any of the websites or any of the organizations that are part of the Trust Project and know that there's there's a commitment there to be responsive and to respond to user concerns, to think about suggestions for coverage, let's say, and make a correction when necessary. So that's our public engagement, actionable feedback, trust indicator, which I think is so important, particularly now when there are such challenges to journalism, to the reputation of journalism from at every level. So that's something I would encourage sites to think about doing, really building that up. And there's some great folks in INN who are very good at that. Another question, if organizations are interested in becoming involved with the Trust Project, what are the steps to do so? Well, let me explain a little bit about that. What you do is you, as I said, you go to the website. There's a collaborator page where there's a form there that you can fill out. Then we'll get back to you. You can come and learn more at a session that we offer with everybody. And then we ask you to fill out some qualifying questions to make sure, basically that every site that participates truly does have journalism at their core. So I know that's true for everybody who's part of INN. We get inquiries from all over the world where sites might be more, aggregators or even hyperpartisan sites. And so by becoming part of the Trust Project, you know that this network really is a network of others who are committed to real journalism, who are committed to these standards, and then promoting these standards throughout the world and helping the public understand that. And so finally, once you filled that out, you've been approved, reviewed and approved, then you can join a cohort. We call these our different phases. And then we walk you through the whole process. And if you're on WordPress, then we work with INN Labs, who actually created our WordPress plugin for us to make that available to you. And then finally, if you like, to help you customize it to your needs. So yeah, Coburn here is a shout out to the plugin, I think.
I think you and I both simultaneously gave a shout out to INN Labs. So thank you. I think I see Miranda and Kay possibly on this call. So thank you guys again.
I would just echo that. It's made implementation of this a world of difference. So thank you.
Yeah, and I would just say in terms of also who is invited in to participate, we do have, like if you're a younger news organization, it might be harder to get approval. We look for a track record. So you might want to wait a little while to apply. Or you might want to apply now and just see how you do if you have really strong journalistic background on your staff. And again, if any sites that are more, we look for nonpartisanship, we look for impartiality in reporting, and original journalism as really being key. So just checking here to see if there's some other questions to answer. One of the things that I wanted to really highlight is what we do know about how building trust does translate to loyalty, does translate to potential revenue. So we worked with the Center for Media Engagement early on because we had done all this research to try to understand and development to try to understand what is it we should show to the public to try to help them recognize trustworthy news and support it. But we didn't know whether it would work. So the Center for Media Engagement at UT Austin did some research. We commissioned them to do it, and they warned us it might not work. Be prepared for that. And in fact, the results were very, very encouraging, and they got statistically significant differences between those people who had not seen trust indicators on the pages that were shown and those who did. And there were about 1,100 participants, half who saw trust indicators on 4 different types of stories and half who did not. And what we found also, or they found in subsequent studies, was they don't seem to have the same effect individually. So if you do something here, something there, I think that's a great start, but it turned out that didn't have the same impact as if you do all of it. There also was a really intriguing and important finding was it gets to trust, links to loyalty, gets to willingness to pay. And that is, they found that 33% of people were more willing to pay, expressed a willingness to pay for more news from that site when the trust indicators were present. They also saw interest in returning back to that site for more news and interest in sharing information from that site or talking with friends and relatives about that. So there's lots of really interesting, pointers there to the strong connection between trust, loyalty, and revenue. And we're also exploring this more deeply through partnerships with our news partners and research partnerships. And I know several have tried actually linking their subscription pleas or requests for signing up for a newsletter or any of those things where you're drawing in loyalty, you're drawing in potential subscriptions. They've linked that to their commitment to building a trustworthy news product. So let me just ask if any of our panelists want to weigh in on that, like some of the things that you've tried. And I know you don't have the data yet, but what are some of the, directions that the metrics are pointing and the data is pointing?
Sally, I can jump in quickly on that. We actually used the trust indicator logo in some of our when we have a paywall across our site. So it's not like a nonprofit where you're traditionally relying on membership, and but that the content's generally open. But we've been using the trust indicator logo on some of our things, and as you noted, like, it's a little early to share any data, but whether it's using that logo or emphasizing transparency, trust, reliability, that's a big part of the reason that we emphasize that, and that it's because we know that if you don't trust the source, again, you're not likely to be willing to pay for it. And so more to come, but it's certainly something that we're eager to explore more.
Yeah, thanks. And we've been doing that with a site in Italy and also one in Brazil. So we're just trying to see, and I know some sites have done it in Canada and tried this. So we're really, I think there is a lot of potential there. So to close, we're getting close to the end here, and I'm just, please, those of you who are listening, please put your questions here so we can try to get them answered. And I would just ask, like, what is one recommendation that each of you would have in terms of connecting trust to loyalty to revenue streams? And it can be, that's a wide open question. So it can be like the one thing that you would do to build trust, or the one thing you would do to help readers and the public more generally understand why journalism is worth supporting. So let's start with Francisco, and then we can go to Dan and Colbert.
Okay, basically on our side, I think that after we got the trust project on the that we joined them, there was a big difference in regards to support from our other advertisers. They realized that our commitment to developing a strong route also in an online version, it was in the same level that we did for a print format. So basically, having that trust mark, joining the trust project, having everything organized, and them seeing what this represented gave them the confidence to say, hey, we're also going to work with you in this other area. So I think that for us was a very clear stepping stone in how you can already be positioned as a good journalist in a certain format, but then once you want to position yourself in another format, well, it's a whole different story. So in this way, that's how we got, I think, a very clear example. And more things are happening every day. We're getting newer companies that want to participate on the website because they see how the information is being developed. And I think that having the trust indicators and people sharing the news and seeing that gives you kind of a warranty that lets people know that you have a process, that you have a method. And I come back also to something that Dan said earlier, which is the corrections. I don't know exactly how it works here in the States, but in Spain, more than likely you would have to go through a judicial procedure in order to get a correction. And most of the sites, won't do it just as a request and are not willing. But by us having the corrections policy on the best practices page, people understand how do we handle that. And they also understand that we have committed ourselves to recognize when there's a mistake and how to mend it. So I think, once again, the combination of all those factors gives that increase in options to monetize and create revenue from doing a good job, you know. So
Okay, yeah, thank you. And I mean, for you, it may be advertisers, for others, it may be other revenue streams. So it's really important. And I also see some of our news partners using their efforts to build trust as a way to build their newsletter audiences and build kind of strengthen those areas too. Dan, how about you? What are some core things you want to leave the audience with regarding connecting trust with loyalty and revenue, and then and what are some things they can do, or one thing?
Well, loyalty is a key focus for us, and for our metrics. It's some of the goals that we have for our audience is focused on things like the number of sessions per users. We know that if we can get a user to us 4 times within a 30-day period, they're very highly likely to subscribe. And so, we focus a lot on trying to understand the kinds of content that get people to come back, and really that comes down to what's sort of local, in our case, unique, differentiated, that they can't find somewhere else. And again, a lot of that just comes down to delivering reliable information that they can't find somewhere else. If we're giving them, in sort of a bundled way, a product that they and news and information that helps them lead better lives, make better decisions, all of that feeds into loyalty, gets them to form the habit, come back consistently, and hopefully, eventually pay us for the work. And again, I will use the last 2 major sort of news cycles with coronavirus and the protests that we launched our pay model 2.5 years ago at this point, something like that. And we're still growing in subscriptions across all, I will say particularly the publications where we have the trust indicators, the growth there. And of course, it's for a lot of reasons, but I have every reason to believe that this is a key point. Particularly the ones that have launched the trust indicators. And again, I don't, if our audience didn't trust us to deliver that information during these really critical moments when, again, whether it's a natural disaster or a pandemic, whatever it is, I don't think we'd continue to see the growth, and we're continuing to see the growth even now. And so it's an indication that, we really try to study hard what is it that our users, need. And I think the good news is a lot of what they're willing to pay for, we can know, like, some number of people are on this story that decided to subscribe. It tends to be that high value content where you have to put in a lot of time. You're using the trust indicators to explain deep sourcing and methodology on some investigation. Some of the pieces that drive the most subscriptions are the ones that are the most detailed, the most in-depth, have the most sourcing methodology, all of those things. And it just adds to, where even people who normally might criticize us for being this side of the aisle or that side of the aisle say, actually, this was like really, really good. And so all of that's, again, just an indication that we're doing the right thing, and we just have to keep getting better and better at it. But again, no trust, certainly no loyalty, and no subscriptions.
Okay, thank you. Very clear. Coburn, you get the last word on this question.
Sure. And so we don't have advertising on our site, and we don't have a paywall. So again, most of our revenue comes from individual donors and foundations. So having the Trust Project, I think, has been really important to help us just strengthen our brand and raise our profile, not just with the public, but with other media organizations. We were actually just about to launch a social media campaign using the Trust Project like moments before the pandemic hit, and we had to shift priorities. But one of our model is that we distribute our news through our media partners in Wisconsin, and more frequently through national media partners and collaborations. So we have noticed more national media coming to us in the last 2 years, looking to work with us on partnering on stories. Partly because Wisconsin's a really interesting state to report in right now, but I also like to think that because of the strength of our brand and the strength of our reporting, and anybody, again, like I said, coming to our site can clearly see who we are and what we stand for, is really helping us to raise our profile and just prove that we are a very trustworthy source.
Well, great. And to me, it's really exciting to see how many news organizations are so committed to building trust and to strengthening our relationship with the public and with our sources. So I just want to kind of tell everyone that, again, what we do at the Trust Project is very collaborative. It's very kind of journalism generated in response to the public, and essentially a movement to on the part of the industry to respond to this crisis of trust in news, and now the attacks on news, and to respond to our central mission, which is to serve the public. So I hope that this was a useful conversation for you, and I really want to thank our panelists for your time today and your preparation in advance, and just welcome anybody who's interested to go to our website, learn more. It's thetrustproject.org. And also just feel free to email. I put the contact information in chat.